I wanted to talk about how I use Dagger and I use for writing integration tests. The whole topic, the whole idea, I think it's s simplistic, but at the same time, I wanted to present that because I thought um, but I wanted to kind of like pay my appreciation for that solution. And even though I understand the Dagger is not specifically for that, but I thought it's for me it's very helpful, and I think it's going to be helpful for a long time. Um, Unfortunately, I can't present the main project I work on because just my client project is just not open source. So I had to build a smaller project to present that, what I'm working on. But maybe in the future it will open source too, the other project, and then maybe I can share that too. So how I use the Dagger. So I don't use for CI yet, which I understand that's the main purpose or the main goal or main target for the Dagger. I use for writing integration tests, and it's just that's very simple. So just imagine a general application, general purpose application, or actually you could imagine CMS, or you can imagine that as a as a tool that's trying to solve the very general data management for every every company that who would use test management would use any resource management tool now. So obviously you want to test it, and you could write unit tests, and it's it can increase the quality a little bit. And now after you start to think about writing integration tests, and you would think about like scaling up the cloud, scaling up instances in the cloud, and then running integration tests there. But if it wouldn't work, or you have to work with the timing and the infrastructure itself. So, and of course, that's true for the end test cases. It's not really ideal, and I decided to use Dagger for that purpose and writing test cases like unit tests, and at the same time testing almost testing functionalities if it was almost live. So I just drew a simple diagram here. So how I write the test with Dagger. So I using the containers, and then all the containers have a CLI that can read comments from the test case. I might demo that. It's not very sophisticated, and it calls the API, which is an API from a service that it's run has been executed from a Docker container, and then as it runs the API, or it calls the API, get the response and send it back to the Dagger, and obviously the Dagger can output that result, and then after I can verify that result if it made sense. Now, in a unit test like test case, I'm able to not only test one single layer or one single unit, but I'm able to test if the data really created in the database, because obviously I'm not just only scaling up the web service instance. Also scaling up the database or the any other services that needs to be run, for example, Redis, I could use a protocol server, authorization service to authorize data or access. Now I can test the whole thing in a unit test like test when it's really integration test. I understand it might be unorthodox for some people, but I'm trying to really approach thing that I feel like it's really effective for the long run. And also have kind of a bit of background of automation tests, because I was working on a product that was built for automation tests, but it was just for Windows application. And I really felt the power of the automations of the test cases. Now, I just little bit summarized why I choose the Dagger, but I think I already exposed that. So writing integration tests, the Dagger figures writing unit tests, source service orchestration. So that's one of the things I didn't really find before Dagger, the service orchestrations. By that I mean it waits So whenever you create containers and you binding together and to wait for each other. And obviously, it's not an unsolvable thing, but it's just very handy that you can get in the SDK and you just write the whole thing and you can verify it in the end. And again, I understand it's not a rocket science, but it's just very helpful for me. So I was really happy to understand or like realize that I can use for it the Dagger. Oh, I duplicated a little bit here. Sorry for that. I'm gonna do it real quick. So the idea is what I would change, or like it's not a best word. So what I would improve regarding the API. I find that very useful, and I didn't really have problem with that yet. But I would be happy just for my purpose or just for my use case to have to be able to bind the host network to the container. I'm not sure if it will violate any security risk or it would be against the Dagger engine or any kind of architectural decision has been made before. But for me, for my use case, that would be amazing. And I think it would be good to share where I heard about first time the Dagger. So Laszlo Fogas, one of my friend, he does weekly streams on LinkedIn, not only LinkedIn, but I think mainly on LinkedIn. And he experienced or that he played with Dagger, and I that's the first time I heard about it. So I thought it's going to be helpful to share that. Now, a quick demo, what's going on, just, just see the code. But again, I understand it's not a rocket science, but I just thought it's helpful to share. So, this project is called Adapting, but it's really just imagine a very simple CMS-like application that's just orchestrates data and needs authorization, needs database, obviously, registration, and so on. And let's start with, for example, the health check you want to test. I use Jinko and Gomega for building test cases. If you didn't hear about that, it's extremely useful testing framework. And I'm trying to, so that would be interesting thing to see how we can merge the Gomega or the Jinkos testing architecture, because what the Jinko can do, I'm not trying to go to the sidelines or just real quick. So what it can do is like nicely you can structure your test cases and you can write little nodes or functions, and then you can structure your test cases embeddedly. So now if you call just one test on that, it will just calls the dependencies. And now if you imagine that you have multiple test cases or that relying the same dependency, then you can use the advantage of caching. And I understand the Dagger has some cache involved, but for some reason, for me, sometimes just always rebuild it. So that would be another thing to see how these two things can be combined to be extremely powerful. Obviously, if that path makes sense at all, for me it does, but obviously we have different viewpoints. So what you can see here is just really using the client, creating a directory. I build the code. I think that's how I bypass the caching, and I just make the code from this LLP. That's really just a CMS application. You can see that. You can imagine like that. And then I create output for it here, I think, yes. And then so that is just for the build. And after I ran the as a web service, and after in the test case, I build a little CLI tool that I can pass data to. What it should call on the API, that makes sense. So this is how I avoid or how I bypass the lack of functionality of being able to binding the host network to the Dagger. Again, that's just my use case. Maybe I'm against some strategy here, but I just find it extremely helpful. Now, for example, I focus this test case here. So I'm just going to run this one. And let's run debug mode. Maybe if it failed, I will see why it's failing, but it should pass. And I think in the repository there are test cases about that, also like this, testing the DB, as far as I remember. But it was kind of like a um reverse test case, or like written. The test was written in a main file, and then the test case. So the actual test case was written in the main file, and the test code was in the test file. So as far as I remember, but so it's not totally identical, the structure what I wrote and being used in the Dagger, but the abstract idea is the same. So now, as you can see, it's passed, and what it really checks is if it returns with the expected value, it's 0.0.0. It's like just a health check endpoint, and I could go to explaining other test cases, which, for example, test the user endpoint, which is again a really general endpoint that a CMS application could have, but I might not waste the time on that because it's just hardly readable at this point. Not extremely hard, but as you can see that I get the first database. I have this serverless application service. What it does is just solving the authorization for me, and run it for as a service, and the backend is just going to bind to these services. And this is what I meant when I said it's really cool to see it solves the orchestration of services. I could do that, but it's just very extremely helpful to have it as in the API or in the SDK. And I just writing test cases to each endpoint it has. I use GraphQL, but you could obviously use to do anything. Now, and I run the CLI again, which is just for being able to bypass the lack of ability to uh, binding the host network to the containers. Because if I didn't have, if I had this, or if the Dagger had this ability, I could directly call the API from the test case. That would be slightly more um, uh, easier, or easy. Uh, and yes, as you can see, I get back from data and I verify the data if it's as it expected. So, so this is how I use it. And again, I understand it's not a rocket science, but I wanted to show that because just it was extremely helpful for me and might be a good idea for someone else, or I can get actual feedback if I'm just on the very bad road. So that would be it. Maybe this question comes
That was
now.
awesome, Csaba. Thank you so much for that.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I just want to reiterate that the test case that or the kind of the integration test use case is definitely a core one for Dagger, and not just build and not just like deploy, but definitely the test cases and the integration tests. That's why we have that whole service construct. So I think you did an amazing job showing that off. I'll post a link in the chat with a little more resources for the version of Dagger that you're using, which is not using modules and functions yet. I'll
Mhm.
paste a doc there that might be helpful for you about more like connecting from host and so forth. For Dagger that we have now from 0.10 and onwards, now we've got things a little bit more
Mhm.
sandboxed away from the host. So again, it's
Mhm.
interesting discussions happening about how to expose that in like safe and useful ways. And I also would mention that the Cerbos example that you showed, they just wrote a module and was published yesterday in the Daggerverse. So I'll put a link to that
Oh,
too, because yeah, really cool to see it here in the wild. And the fact that they just wrote a module, it's pretty happy timing. So thank you so much.
thank you very much.